Hey, good afternoon or good morning or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is David Grady. I'm with the Security Solutions team here at Verizon Business Group, and you're here for the Data Breach Investigation Report webinar today, looking really at the small, medium business market and the data that we found in the new report. For folks who aren't familiar with the Data Breach Investigation Report, I'm going to give you a little bit of background, but in a minute, I'm going to introduce Suzanne Widdop, who's one of the co-authors of this report, and she's going to really walk us through most of the data. But for folks who, as I said, may not know what the DBIR is, this is the 14th year that Verizon has published this report, and it really is the gold standard for research into actual data breaches and actual security incidents that happened over the previous year, with information and data contributed from all over the world, from private companies and technology companies and government agencies and law enforcement, as well as Verizon's research as well. So the report has, for 10, 12, 13, now 14 years, been really viewed as I said, the gold standard. Security leaders across the world look forward to the release of the DBIR every year. And a big reason the DBIR is so well received is because it is data-driven. It is not a commercial with advertisements for products or anything like that. Many of the data, as I said, comes from other partners, and it is really meant to inspire and teach security stakeholders and security leaders how to focus their efforts in the most meaningful way to make their organizations more secure. Now, on this webinar, you have an opportunity to ask some Q&A, I believe. There's a question mark over there. We'll keep our eye on that, and if there's some questions, we can get to those. I believe there's also a download section here where you can download a copy of the Data Breach Investigation Report from 2021, which is only published a few weeks ago, so it's still warm off the presses. And in addition to that, you can download a sort of a subset of the report that specifically talks about small, medium business and the risks and the ways to mitigate those risks. So again, very quickly, I want to just give you some context here. 14 years. This year, we have information from 88 countries, where unfortunately victims were victimized by cybercrime. 83 contributors, as I mentioned, law enforcement, government agencies, researchers and such, an amazing group of people and organizations giving us that data. Nearly 80,000 incidents. Incidents teach us about what happened and how the bad guys operated and did things that were upsetting. And again, this report sort of dissects all those incidents and helps you understand what you can do to stop them. And then again, a subset of that, almost 5,300 actual data breaches, which resulted in information being either leaked or stolen or accessed improperly in an unauthorized manner. So every year, this body of information and insight grows and grows. But the value for you as a small and medium business owner, you may not have security front of mind, top of mind every day. You've got other things to do. You got payroll and customers and just keeping the lights on. But security is, that underlying capability that you really do need to have. This report puts it into plain language, help you understand where to focus most of your efforts on in the industry that you're in. So you're not trying to do everything equally, but you're doing the things that matter most. So in this report, we're going to have Suzanne walk through, and first she's going to talk about what the report found in general, because it's very interesting and educational. And then we're going to transition a little bit to SMB. Suzanne, I'm sorry, I love to talk. So before I come to you, though, I do want to let people know we have a poll here, and hopefully you can see the poll on the little icon. But as an owner or operator of an SMB, how do you view cybersecurity? We'd love to hear your thoughts on that while Suzanne is presenting. So, Suzanne, why don't you take over, as it were? But first of all, tell us about yourself. You're part of an elite team that creates this report.
Yes, we are a tiny team too. There's only 5 of us. So I've been doing this report for 9 of the 14 years now. And one of the things that we really do like to stress about our research, this is based on actual cases worked by actual people, not, anecdotal or that sort of thing. And so it's really quite good to be able to see what's really happening out there. Now, this particular slide, one of the other things that I do want to highlight is that this is the first year that we have recalibrated our patterns, our attack patterns, and we'll get into more on what that means in a little bit. But just this graphic here shows you sort of, if you're familiar with the old patterns, where those attacks mapped from the old ones into the new ones. And so later on, you may want to sort of look at this kind of a graphic. It's available. Of course, all of these are available in the report as well. So you can revisit them as needed. Okay. And then last year, we also took a look at the first several months of data that we had on data breaches during the pandemic. If you're interested in the report, we actually have a link that shows where to get that article so you can read it yourself. But we sort of wanted to revisit it and see, you know, whether we were right in what we were expecting or not. And some of it we certainly were. You know, we expected an increase in the phishing lures that were based on the pandemic, and we saw that quite a bit. And we also expected the continued success of the ransomware groups. What we didn't see that we expected, though, was we expected errors to increase because, you know, the thought was there were going to be a lot of companies hastily standing up infrastructure in support of remote work, and the potential for errors there would be, you know, pretty high. But we did not see errors increase as a proportion of the data set. Instead, we saw social really just take off. And so, you know, the way this works, proportionally, if one thing goes up, something else has to go down. So the social attacks went up and the errors actually went down, although we did see in terms of absolute numbers an increase in errors. It just wasn't, you know, big enough to proportionally affect the data. So let's get into the key insights of the report this year. And this is our first one. So 85% of breaches involving a human element. So what does that mean? This is not just phishing. It's also things like error and other elements where human interaction becomes, you know, something relevant to the breach. For social actions, we saw a sharp rise in the misrepresentation variety of social attacks. And if you're not familiar with that, this is when the actor gains access to your infrastructure and then leverages it to further penetrate your organization. So an example would be, say somebody has compromised your CFO's email account and then starts sending email out as that CFO, trying to get other people compromised as well. And so we really saw that increase tremendously, and it's usually part of a business email compromise. And we have more data on that coming up as well. So 61% of breaches involving credential data. Now, my favorite quote from the report this year, and no, I did not write it, was that credentials are the glazed donuts of data types.
That's good.
Everybody loves credentials. They're just so useful in moving around the victim organization. And really, if you can gain access to a super user or other privileged account, it's like having sprinkles on your donuts, right?
Now I'm hungry.
I know, now I want donuts. So ransomware, as I mentioned, we saw a lot of success there. And if you haven't really been paying attention to ransomware, just after the data gathering cutoff for last year's report, we saw a change in the tactics, starting with the Maze group. And what they did is they began taking a copy of the data prior to triggering the encryption process. And they then use the threat of releasing the data that they took to further, you know, encourage their victims to pay up for the ransom. So before this happened, we used to see ransomware cases quite a bit, but they would wind up being, you know, both an integrity violation for the software installation of the ransomware and an availability violation, because of course you can no longer access your data. But now they're also a confidentiality violation because they're taking this additional copy of the data. And so because of that, we have seen them become 10% of the breaches in our data set, which is a huge change. And it's all because of their change in tactics. And it's become so popular that so many groups have sort of jumped on the bandwagon that they've actually created infrastructure to facilitate both their victim naming and shaming, and to have a way to release the data easily if the person, you know, or the organization rather, does not pay up the ransom. So as the pandemic ramped up, we actually saw more companies that were leveraging the cloud to sort of handle the load. The attackers also noticed this was happening. And so we saw a lot more breaches affecting the cloud infrastructure, at least for those where we knew where the assets were when they were attacked. And so we saw that more often than on the on-premises assets, but we do, sort of give a caveat here before you get all excited about cloud, that there was enough that we just didn't know where they were, that it could easily, tip the balance one way or another. But it was interesting to see, at least, that we were getting a fair amount of data that cloud was definitely being affected.
And Suzanne, before you go on, I want to ask about cloud for a minute.
Okay.
I know you're going to do a deeper dive on the SMB sort of data set, but increasingly, correct me if I'm wrong, small and medium-sized businesses are relying more on cloud applications and cloud providers for certain parts of their business, right? So cloud is not some big enterprise, multi-million-dollar, global company thing, right? This is increasingly a vector for attack that small and medium businesses need to take some attention to, right?
Absolutely, because one of the things that we do discuss in the small medium business section when we talk more about that is how a lot of these small organizations are leveraging, all the same kinds of services that are available to the large organizations so that they can be more competitive. And so that tends to make their attack surface wider than it would otherwise be. And that's definitely a risk.
Right. I'll get out of your way. Please keep going.
Okay. So there's not much of a surprise in this slide. Most breaches are perpetrated by people who do not work for your company or for a company that you do business with. And most of them are financially motivated. So criminals will always follow the money. We can count on them for that. And we did see internal actor caused breaches continue their downward trend again this year. It's happened for the past couple of years now. And keep in mind that for the internal actor breaches, this includes both errors and malicious actions. So it's not just employees doing bad things. It's also employees doing oopses, so to speak. Everybody likes to try and chip away at the impact question because it's a very hard problem to solve. It's hard to quantify what an impact of a breach really is and get all of the pieces because there's so many pieces that impact can be measured with. And so we looked at data from the FBI, we look at data from insurance companies, and some other studies that are out there. So the chart on the left here, it measures two kinds of financial impact, what we call loss and cost. And this is the data from the FBI. So the acronyms here, BEC is for business email compromise, CDB is for computer data breach. And you can see in those two bars that the monetary loss is in a range, and the black line is showing what the median figure is. So those two bars plus the ransomware bar, that shows you what the direct loss data is, where actual cash changed hands. And then the other two bars, the forensic and legal, those show you the costs incurred for responding to a data breach. Now the right-hand chart, I'm sorry, what?
I was going to say, yeah, if you're in an industry that has regulations and you're required to notify, that can get very expensive very quickly. The breach.
Yeah. And of course, then we wind up with the problem of, who's going to sue you after as well. And so that can drive the legal costs really high. Now, the right-hand chart here is some interesting research that was done on stock prices and of breached companies versus unbreached companies on the NASDAQ. And, a lot of them a lot of these studies look at, short-term impact, but this one also looked at, long-term impact as well, and found that there was some indication that there was longer term impact for breached companies that don't do as well as their peers. The question, of course, is it because of the breach? So causation is very difficult to prove. It could also be, something else that's going on in the organization that might even have contributed to the breach. It's hard to say. And then finally, we also looked at some simulated breaches. Again, it shows confidence intervals here and a median range, and the range can be very wide. The outliers can see both, very high and very low values. And so our advice really here is to plan for the confidence interval that you are most comfortable with, while realizing that the impact may be higher or lower depending on a number of factors. And it's kind of hard to know which, where you're going to fall in that.
Now, Suzanne, before you get into the patterns, I just want to remind folks who maybe joined a little bit late, they can download the DBIR from this interface, as well as an SMB, sort of a sub report on that. But I also I'm going to ask you all to hang in there, because when we when we do get, through this presentation, you're going to see that the DBIR doesn't just describe the problems and the challenges that SMBs are facing. The DBIR really talks about the controls, the capabilities that a company like yours needs to mitigate as much risk as you can in the most efficient way. So we are going to talk a little bit later about those controls, but I just want you all to know as you're listening that the first half of this is about the real issues and the actions and the patterns, but we are also going to get to some good advice too, so you won't just be leaving here depressed.
I hope you're not leaving depressed. So our new patterns are more focused on sort of what happened during the breach, and therefore they're really good for control recommendations. And so hopefully that will give you a good place to figure out where to go from here. So if you are a fan of prior reports, you know that in 2014, we did a cluster analysis of over 100,000 security incidents, and we identified our 9 attack patterns. Now, we did this largely because it's easier to get your arms around defending against 9 attack patterns than it is 100,000 individual attacks, right? We revisited those patterns, and in our report, we provide way more detail into how we did the patterns than most people are going to want. But if you are into that, there's lots of detail there for you to dig into in the report. We did have a problem last year where we saw the everything else pattern, which is supposed to be sort of our catch-all bucket for things that don't fit in the other patterns. It wound up being prevalent in many of the industries. And that being one of the top 3 was sort of our indication that it was time to do a recalibration, because when you've got your catch-all bucket that's supposed to be small becoming very large, you've got a problem, right? So this graphic is showing you our new patterns over time. Our prior slide here actually showed that how well these patterns are describing it. They're above 90% of the data is described, and our everything else pattern is now very small, like it should be. And that makes us happy.
Yeah.
And of course, at the beginning of the presentation, I showed you that graphic that said, how they broke out as far as the old patterns and the new patterns. And we had a couple of patterns that were kind of retired. It's not that those attacks never happen. It's that they happen so much less frequently that they are small enough that they belong in the everything else pattern now. One of them is the payment card skimmers. We saw such a reduction of those that it was quite surprising over the past couple of years, and particularly last year we saw hardly any of them.
Is that because of the prevalence of the chips and other payments systems?
It's probably a combination of that. And, in the public data set in particular, we used to see, you could almost map them as far as people would fly in, usually from Eastern European countries, and then they would sort of put skimmers on all the vulnerable places they could find, going down almost like a highway. And then they'd, get to the end and they'd just take off with their data. With the pandemic, travel was much more restricted. And so we think that part of it was that they just couldn't come and do that. And I mean, I'm going to tell you multiple times, our data gives us the what, it doesn't give us the why, but that was kind of our speculation and part of why that went down.
That's interesting. Thank you.
Sure. Okay, so we call this pattern, this graphic rather, the dog, because I can't look at it now without seeing a canine shape in the dots. So the system intrusion pattern is where those complex multi-step attacks ended up. It's kind of the smarter, older sibling of the basic web application attacks pattern. And it's where a large percentage of the malware and hacking cases ended up. It's also where most of the ransomware cases ended up. Now, the data type that we used to see targeted in the more complex cases was the payment card data, but you can see by this graphic how much it has dropped over the years. And as I mentioned, we get the what, we don't get the why. It may be because so many other data types can be monetized, and the payment card data is well monitored for fraudulent use by the payment card industry. They have their common point of purchase fraudulent notifications that they do. Whereas, something like your social security number, there's no system out there looking for fraudulent use of your social security number. And so if, data is compromised and it gets used for fraud, typically it's not the organization that was breached that finds out about it. It's the person whose data it was about that finds out about it. And so it's much harder to detect. So I tell people that one thing you can count on in addition to death and taxes is that your employees will make mistakes. And as I've mentioned, this decreased as a percentage proportion of the data set, but it has increased in terms of absolute numbers. This year we had more breaches than we had last year. We also had more error breaches than we had last year. And so it went up. It's just some of the other things went up more. That's all. You can see here with this graphic who is most responsible for the errors. And it makes some sense that, sysadmins and developers in particular are going to have access to a fair amount of data, probably more than others. And that misconfiguration number there is very high as well. And that brings us to this. So, we had this pairing of the system administrator doing a misconfiguration on some kind of database, and then the discovery method being the security researcher. And the security researchers have their specialized search engines, and they're really good at detecting particular kinds of data stores out there on the internet. And they put them to really good use and find all these little nuggets of data sort of laying about. And then they get the fun of figuring out whose data they found and making those notifications. And so we have this increasing the past several years. Every year it's been increasing. Now you see the more simple attacks targeting web application servers in this pattern. It also shows the difference in the on-prem versus the cloud. The credential attacks were leveraged against web applications, regardless of how the attackers got their hands on them. Sometimes these credential stuffing attacks are just a compilation of some of the big credential breaches that have happened in the past, and the problem of credential reuse is a huge one. And really, we tell people that, you're going to have a certain percentage of your employees that use the same password across multiple domains. The only way to make those credentials less valuable is to use multi-factor authentication, so that even if they use the same password, they don't get the other factor of authentication and they can't actually get into your systems that way. And that's really, the most effective way of combating that. So this graphic shows the prevalence of that credential stuffing attack problem. With a range of attacks between 637 and 3.3 billion malicious login attempts through the year, it's clear that organizations really do need to take, steps to reduce the value of those credentials, because they're out there. There's lots of people who have compilations and will just hammer away at your infrastructure with it. And if you don't have something to combat it, you're going to find that you've been a victim of a breach. So the social engineering pattern is one of our new ones. And you can see that one of those attack varieties has really taken off in the past years, the business email compromise. And if you're not familiar with it, this is a social engineering attack where the attacker invents a plausible scenario to attempt to facilitate usually a wire transfer of funds to them. It used to be that they would ask for data. For a while, it was big that they would ask for like W-2 information of employees. But then they just started asking for money and found that that worked well. So, they kind of switch gears and do that more often now instead. We also looked at the data of companies that provide phishing testing and training to organizations. And it was really interesting to see that the number of clicks on the templates varied pretty widely, with some of them getting over 50% rather click rates. So some are definitely more successful than others. And it also speaks to the success of the actual phishers who are able to craft very convincing arguments in their phishing lures. The actual phishing emails, as opposed to the training ones, had a much better success rate in getting those clicks. And, it stands to reason, because criminals are going to be highly motivated because, of course, if they're successful, they get direct payouts. Whereas, if the training templates are successful, well, that becomes a metric. It doesn't so much, get them actual cash, right?
Mm-hmm. And I got to say, not to belabor it, but you touched on COVID earlier, and I know late last year your team put out sort of a mid-year COVID risk report. But it's incredible the way that the bad guys have taken advantage of the sort of the new dynamic where everyone's stressed out. They're worried about their health. They're worried about their jobs. They're worried about their kid in the other room doing their homework. They're worried about the 18th consecutive video call that they need to be on. And then when you're at that level of distraction and at that level of fatigue and worry, and anxiety, that's where, you're going to fall for a fish, because it's going to look real and you're going to be in a hurry. So, it's easy to say and hard to do, but, one of the biggest things you can do is to take your time and reread it, or pick up the phone and check on who sent it to you. But anyway,
yes.
It's just, all right, go for it.
Yeah, that out-of-band validation can make a huge difference in especially a business email compromise. So wanted to briefly take a look at the industries, because while this is SMB focused, everybody's going to fall into one of these industries. And so every year we break out the patterns into their respective industries, and we provide this because it's useful for people, to sort of see how differently some industries are experiencing attacks. Later, we actually break out the patterns into the critical controls. And so it's sort of between this one and that graphic, it gives you an idea of, this is what I'm going to be hit with. This is how to best combat that particular kind of attack. And so it sort of gives you a roadmap. And that was why we usually do this, is we're trying to give you something that you can actually use to make things better. So now we get into the small, medium business that we looked at this year. And so looking at organizations that have less than 1,000 employees, which is what we define as small and medium business, versus the larger organizations that have over 1,000 employees. We were surprised this year, actually, to see that the two are converging. The patterns that were there were not only the same for both, but they were also in the same ranking. So, you look here and it's almost identical, and that was quite surprising. But what does it mean, right? It means smaller organizations, when they use some of the same kinds of technologies and services like the cloud, have been able to act like their, large business competitors, which is great in terms of the ability to compete, but not so great in terms of attack surface. The system intrusion pattern, which was number one for both, is where the more complex attack patterns are. It shows that regardless of size, the attackers are targeting your business. There's no flying under the radar because you're a tiny shop. If you have some kind of internet presence, you have an attack surface. And the other reason this is, concerning is that small businesses tend to have a lack of dedicated security staff. And so that's a real problem, because, how are you going to know that you've been successfully compromised? So we expected to see a difference in time to discovery of a breach, for the smaller organizations, given that, fewer resources are being dedicated to security, but we didn't see that. There's a slight uptick in the months and weeks to detect for small versus large, but the years figure for small businesses is actually better than the large counterparts. Again, we can't say why in the data, we can say what, but we suspect it may be in part related to the sheer complexity of infrastructure that large organizations have versus smaller organizations. And when the infrastructure is smaller, the people who are maintaining it, they can gain a better depth of knowledge on what normal looks like and be able to identify when something's gone off the rails, so to speak. And it may also be a function of smaller organizations outsourcing security management of their environments. So, they can, again, function like the bigger organizations. Either way, we're really hoping to see this competency in identifying breaches quickly continue, because that's excellent news. Anytime we can see people identify, that they've been breached quickly, means that they can hopefully recover quickly, and the scope of it is going to be reduced.
I was going to ask if we could go back for a minute. I'm going to go back for a sec. What I want to do real quickly is sort of coach people on how to use the report, because when you download this report and you look at your industry, you're going to see charts that look like this, where you see frequency, top patterns, threat actors, motivations, and such, and the kind of data that gets compromised. So I just want to sort of walk through this like a glossary or key for you at home. When you do download the report and you go to your area, if you're in financial services or if you're in retail or hospitality or whatever, take a look. You'll understand, particularly the top patterns, as Suzanne said, is system intrusion is huge in both large and small business. But when you see threat actors, what that means is, who were the bad guys, and were they external or internal? Were they partners? Were there more than one? It's important to know who the threat actors are, because that's going to help you sort of fine tune your your security focus, your attention. In some industries where internal actors cause data breaches or incidents, that tells you that you have an opportunity or an obligation to look at everything from the way you train your people to the business processes that you have that might lend to mistakes, to whether or not you've got a disgruntled workforce and you're about to do a major layoff and everyone's stealing data. So sometimes it's mistakes, sometimes it's laziness or sloppiness, and sometimes malice. But I just wanted to show you, like, even the motivation is important to know. That sometimes you have a target on your back for financial reasons, but sometimes it's for other reasons as well. It could be a grudge. So please just know that this is sort of the vocabulary for when you're looking at this report after this call today. Suzanne, thanks. I know you want to talk about the controls, which is like the moral of the story is, now that we know all the problems, what do we do now? This is the so what.
That's right. So this year, as we did last year, we mapped our patterns to the CIS security controls. This graphic is mapped to the implementation group 1 in the report. We've also got it mapped to 2 and 3. And the way this works is that you start out with implementation group 1 as a starting point, and then the further implementation groups will build on the complexity of the prior group. And it's good for a starting point to make sure that you're sort of doing all the really important things, and then it'll grow with you as your security maturity increases and your organization grows. And so it's pretty useful that way. And knowing which things you're most likely to be hit with based on your industry also allows you to say what's best to combat those kinds of attacks. And so it sort of gives you the whole picture on where do I go from here. And that said, we actually did have these 4 controls appear in most of the industries as useful for combating their top attack patterns. And so if you're really looking for a place to start, you certainly could do worse with beginning with these 4 CIS controls. And we do urge you to go into the report to read the sections. And then after you do that, go over to the CIS website and get more detail, because they have a tremendous amount of detail on what to do with each of these kinds of controls. Certainly more than we can put in our report.
So before we dive into this more information, which you can just certainly look at your convenience or leisure while we're here, we do have a question, and I want to remind folks that there is a question button. So Suzanne, we'll both see if we can take this one. Is there enough data on IoT-related breaches to split that data out, perhaps as an industry subset? We hear a lot in the press about IoT.
Yeah, it's one of those things where we've started looking at, recording whether it was IoT or not. And we do have some data, but it was not enough to actually do much in the way of determining what was going on. We do touch on it in the report, but yeah, still the sample size is small enough that we want more data before we're able to really do much in the way of talking about it.
Sure, and I also want to let the person who asked that question know that a few months ago, Verizon published another report called the Mobile Security Index, and a little bit different from the DBIR in that it's more survey data, but it also collects data and research from about 13 leading mobile security technology companies. So the Mobile Security Index, which is like verizon.com/MSI, does get a little bit into IoT. It'll give you some insight into both the attitudes that about 1,000 people in the industry that we talked to in the survey about their attitudes toward IoT security, as well as some of the research from some of our partners. So maybe over time that'll evolve in the DBIR, maybe not, but you can get that in the MSI. So I do want to, before we go through this again, let's take a look at the survey, okay?
Sure.
I think that you Suzanne, talking about those critical information controls, that can be daunting if you don't have a very big team or a very big budget, but you don't necessarily have to. A lot of that goes to training and awareness. And I know that you said that, the human factor was such a big one. So we asked the question in our poll. Where's the question? We asked the question, as an owner and operator of a small, medium business, how do you view cybersecurity? We asked if you think it's a luxury, a necessity, a cost I can't avoid, a strategic investment, or a competitive differentiator. And I'm glad to see that nobody thinks it's a luxury. We had 0% there. So we've got some great mindful evolution of thought here and attitude. Now, 52% of the respondents to this poll said security is a necessity, and it is. It's just like keeping the lights on or the heat on during the winter, and that's great. But what's interesting too is 17, that just moved. Okay, so 17% believe that's a strategic investment, which is important, I think, and that's a good attitude to have toward it. Doesn't mean you have to overspend. You just strategically invest in your security based on your risk profile, which you can learn about more from this report. And 13% believe security can be a competitive differentiator, which I find interesting. I don't know if you had any thoughts about that, Suzanne, about whether or not organizations use that, or you as a consumer, does that come into your mind?
I think it's going to depend on what industry they're in. Certainly, there's certain industries where you want them to really be very cognizant of the need for security. If the data is sensitive in some way, you don't necessarily want them to be, just throwing it around, so to speak. But it's gonna depend entirely on what kinds of data and what kind of sort of level of sensitivity that data is going to be about in particular. And then, we see it certainly in security companies where they're using it as a differentiator, because that's their sort of their wheelhouse. That, if they can't secure their own data, then it doesn't look good for them as a security competitor, right?
Sure, but I mean, even in a mom and pop shop, or maybe something bigger, maybe a medium sized supplier of some sort of parts or things, increasingly, because there's so much focus on third party risk, that your company might be asked in the contracts to agree to a certain level of security for the data that you're touching. So it may not be a competitive differentiator that you advertise about and brag about and say, look, we haven't been hacked in weeks. That might be silly, but to be able to compete for a contract or an RFP, and to be able to claim, demonstrate, back up, and prove that you've got some security stuff, that might help you win that business over another company who can't claim that or prove it. And increasingly you're being asked that. So I think that's important. And the last bit on this poll, I'm glad to see only 12% think it's a cost I can't avoid. So this is mostly a positive attitude story, but you can't avoid, like you said, taxes or death or payroll taxes, I guess. So no, thank you everybody who participated in the poll. We do have a couple more questions, Suzanne. Oh, no, we don't actually. Somebody just thanked us for telling them about the Mobile Security Index. So we'll keep this open for a minute, but do you want to walk us through? Do you want me to walk through this slide here?
Oh, I can do this. So this is our more information slide. We really do encourage you to download and read the full report. We try hard not to make it a 100-page cure for insomnia. And as Dave mentioned, we did put out that SMB snapshot document that you can take a look at, and it's very much in line with this presentation. Now, if you are doing a presentation of your own and you'd like to use any of our graphics, we post high-resolution versions for anyone to use. And then finally, here we have, you can learn more information about Verus. And I didn't really cover this, but Verus is the vocabulary for event recording and incident sharing. And it's really what underpins the DBIR. So when we get cases, we code them up using Verus, and that's what makes it possible to run our statistics. So there's a fair amount of companies out there that actually implement it themselves. It's free. We give it away because we really think it's important when you're talking about security incidents and data breaches to have some kind of common language. The other thing we have here is the Verus community database. What we're doing there, we get asked quite a bit if we can share the data that underpins the DBIR, and unfortunately that is shared with us under NDA, so we can't directly share that. But what we do here with this project is that we take publicly disclosed data breach events, we code them up in Verus format, and we release that data to the public. And so it's really a complementary data set to the DBIR. It's got well over 1,000. It's got well over 8,000 cases in it. Each one has its own JSON file, so it's really good to sort of snarf into a NoSQL database, and you can ask your questions of the data. And you can also compare and contrast with the data that you've gathered in your own environment, which I'm sure everybody does, right? And then finally, you can ask us a question. While we can't share the data directly, if you have a question, we can run the statistics and answer it without sharing the data. So that's always something that people like to take advantage of. And of course, we have social media that you can follow and that sort of thing. And then this is my information if you want to contact me. And then the Verus DB Twitter handle. So I'm the one who does most of the work on the public data set. And so when I find data breaches, I tweet them out as we put them in our issues list to be coded. So it's basically a feed of data breaches.
It's a heck of a lot of good resources. Thank you. In addition to all these resources, I want to let folks at home know that if you enjoyed this and you think someone in your organization might benefit from hearing this information, which I think in 40 minutes was pretty darn good, you can share this webinar on demand here on the Bright Talk channel, the Verizon Bright Talk channel. We also have another number of other webinars that we've done in the last few weeks, and a few coming up regarding the DBIR, making it a little bit more specific to either industries or to areas of security that you might want to improve. So again, you can search around for the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report webinars on Bright Talk and share those with your colleagues on demand. You can visit us at verizon.com/DBIR for more resources. But Suzanne, I want to congratulate you and the team for another great job this year. It's amazing what 5 people can do when you get some support in the background, but you guys are really the secret stars. And I'm sure you're going to take a day off before you start the 2022 report, right?
Oh, heavens, yes.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us. We'll give you 20 minutes back. We hope you get some value out of this. And that would be the end of our presentation today. Thanks again, Suzanne.
Thank you very much.